Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this discussion about the circular economy in construction and the AJ's ongoing Retrofirst campaign. I'm delighted to be joined this afternoon by Hannah Prowse, who's Head of National Projects at English Heritage, Dr. Colin Beattie, Head of Sustainability at John Robertson Architects, Nicholas Boys-Smith, who's the Founding Director of Create Streets and was also co-chair of the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission. And finally, Mike Thomson, an associate at Arup. So thanks all to you for joining us.
Pleasure.
I think I'd like to get the conversation underway and we will hopefully have some questions coming in from our audience. So please do fire your questions across whenever you feel like doing so. But I'd like to start off this afternoon by asking about the extent to which you think this agenda is getting through to those in power. Maybe I could start with Nicholas here, because obviously he is well known to be in close communication with government and hopefully somebody that they're listening to through things like the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission. There is some recognition, isn't there, Nicholas, of this reuse agenda, but perhaps not by everyone in government.
Thank you, Will, and thank you for inviting me. Hello, everyone. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to. I should preface my remarks, but I wouldn't want to oversell my insight into what anyone anywhere in government thinks about this. So, as always, government isn't one person; it's hundreds of people with different agendas and different departments, and some are ministers and some are officials. So just sort of caveat would be that. But that said, I think there is a good wind behind this. And I think that's because there are sort of a range of good different reasons why you should sort of buy into, and we'll come to what this is in a moment. There's a fundamental point of consistency. The NPPF and the tax base are misaligned. There's obviously a point about the environment. And I think there's also a point about levelling up and not disencouraging investment in areas where you've got lower land values. We can come back to all of those issues. So I think one's capable of building an alliance across different bits of government with different priorities. And obviously the levelling up point is particularly resonant after the 2019 election. My understanding is that officials in DCMS are pretty pro. I know there are people in the Ministry of Housing who are pretty pro. I'm afraid it's often the case. I think probably the case is yet to be made fully with the Treasury. I don't know if the Treasury are watching this, probably not, but I think more work remains to be done. The Treasury's job ultimately is to say no to tax changes where they get less on day one because someone tells them they get more on day 50. So to some degree, they're sort of programmed to be cynical, and I think more work is required. It
isn't just the Treasury, is it? I mean, there's always, and I don't put this down to any one political party, there's always a kind of desire among politicians to produce new and shiny bits of infrastructure, isn't there, which kind of counts against this in some ways?
Possibly. I think that's less. I mean, look, I say with a caveat, I think that's less important. There's a desire to, in this government and in the last one, to build more homes, and typically you turn to the big guys who build lots of homes and who can be credible that they're going to build lots of homes rather than all this other new stuff and fiddly bit around the sides. If the volume house builders are telling any government, trust us, we'll deliver, and look how many thousands of homes we built last year, it's always difficult to break away from a model that, in my view, is fundamentally broken. But you can understand it is the model which is currently delivering. So a government, is always going to be a bit nervous about shifting the indices in favour of someone else. So I think our glass is more than half full, but we don't get anywhere until it's full, I think would be my pithy conclusion.
Thank you. And what's your perspective on this, Hannah? Because you've worked in the private sector, haven't you, for Sir Robert McAlpine recently, and now at English Heritage. What's your take on this?
Well, I think I know that DCMS and other government bodies are looking at this issue, and I think there is more of a desire to join up, as Nicholas said, across government departments, which needs to happen. There are various industry lobby groups who are doing the same thing. The Heritage Alliance have put together a budget synopsis this year, which very firmly pushes for exactly the same issues that the Retrofirst campaign is pushing for. I think public mood is also shifting hugely. Like many other people, I'm sure I saw the Extinction David Attenborough Extinction Programme on Sunday night, which was exceptionally powerful about the state of the planet. And Professor Lord Nicholas Stern was very clear that he sees retrofitting buildings as one of the key economic drivers that could actually be implemented to drive real change. The government has got this 2050 emissions target, which it's nowhere near reaching at present. And with the amount that buildings account for carbon emissions, it's just an aspect that they can't afford to ignore.
Yeah, it's 40 or 45%, isn't it, of UK emissions come from buildings?
Yeah, absolutely. But recent Historic England research shows that actually a well properly retrofitted building is going to emit less carbon by 2030 and by 2050 than a new build equivalent. So the stats are there. The new research that's been done on embodied carbon in existing building stock again strengthens the argument. So I think all the pieces of research are coming into place to be able to make the case even more strongly than has been made in the past.
And Mike, you were obviously an expert on the circular economy in Arup, and I believe, am I right in saying that you're somewhat involved in these governmental matters as well? COP26, for example?
Yeah, we are. I mean, at Arup, we're involved in a number of industry panels that influence that. But I mean, just wanted to come back to a point that Hannah raised as well. And I think it's very important to sometimes, I work a lot in the commercial property sector, but Arup, obviously, we work across all sectors. But perhaps historically there's been this kind of second-hand, second-best type message, and I think, you know, we're starting to see a lot of existing building stock retrofitted, refurbished, upgraded, and really repositioned in the commercial market and other situations as grade A, you know, first class new developments. And I think it's really important that we kind of change this mindset by publicizing and sort of showcasing the best that the industry has got to offer in terms of how we can upgrade existing buildings and really show that that's not a thing. And then sort of coming back to the other point is how one of the things the government is committed to is our transition to a net zero and low carbon economy. And I think using numbers and data to, as we've sort of just started to discuss, to really kind of show just how much reusing existing building stock can save in terms of tons of carbon, I think is really powerful. I mean, that kind of hit home to me. We've upgraded some existing buildings for kind of commercial clients, and we've saved 10, 20, 40,000 tons of embodied carbon by reusing the building and not building a new one. So, you know, 40,000 tons, and, you know, in our personal lives, we say, I won't travel by car or use the train, and, you know, we might save 1 ton by not traveling by car for a year, and, you know, 40,000 tons by reusing one building. And I think when we kind of start to see those kind of numbers, I think hopefully that.
And that's how powerful architects and engineers are, isn't it? And I know, I'm sure a lot of them do grasp that they're the specifiers, particularly architects, of materials. They're the ones who decide a lot of the time, albeit, you know, taking into account what the client ultimately wants. But that's a point that's been made very powerfully by Duncan Baker Brown, the architect who's, you know, behind the Waste House and very innovative things like that, who spoke at our AJ100 awards last year. Colin, what's your view as an architect who works in this area?
My view is very much in line with what Mike was just saying. We do a lot of repositioning work. My being a bit of a numbers nerd, since 2017 we've been looking at the carbon footprint of our buildings. We did our first LCA back then, and we've been doing more and more as time goes by, and it is incredibly powerful how significant the savings are, as Mike was saying. I think one of the things that we've discovered now that we're starting to see some benchmarks, because before, how do you know if that's a good number or a bad number when you're talking about the carbon footprint, and what the leading developers were doing to begin with, they were scratching their heads over it as well. So they would get your designers to design to kind of a sketch design stage, stage 2, and then say, okay, if that's our carbon footprint at this point, if we measure it then, let's set a dynamic target to try and improve on that by a certain percentage. But now things have changed a little bit. We're starting to see industry benchmarks coming through with the RIBA and their Sustainable Outcomes Guide, and LETI as well. LETI have been a massive proponent in terms of getting the knowledge out there, and that's where we've been lacking in the industry for such a long time. So and going back to what Mike was saying as well, in terms of, I mean, Mike's a structural engineer, is that right, Mike?
Yeah, correct.
So, you know, literally 2 weeks ago I finished an LCA which showed a 52% reduction in carbon emissions just by not taking the structure to the ground and building up for one of our projects. And when you look at the RIBA targets, measuring the same building against what those targets are, we're already exceeding RIBA's 2030 targets just by retaining the building. It's a no-brainer. It's quick. It tends to save money. Putting that question aside, it tends to save the client money. They wouldn't do it otherwise. And yeah, it's a fairly straightforward way of getting some fantastic results. Just start with keeping that building as much as you possibly can, realistically.
Sounds like RIBA need to raise their targets, Will. Something for the AJ to campaign on.
Yeah, well, I was about to say, if it makes so much sense, why isn't it happening as standard? Why isn't the government, pushing everybody to do this, or why are they not doing it anyway?
I mean, if I can jump in, if that's okay, in planning policy, we talk about the operational energy of buildings, and I think most clients or developers are now, you would understand if you said my building is performing 35% better than Part L in terms of its in-use operation for heating and cooling, and and that's mandated by planning policy, and there are offset payments required if your building is poorly performing. We don't have that for embodied energy, and I think if we have these emerging rating systems. So, we're working with the Institution of Structural Engineers to develop one for embodied structure. But I think the RIBA ones are whole building ones, and LETI have some targets. And I think, if government policy could mandate you must achieve an A or a B in a ratings bracket for your embodied energy of your building, very quickly when you appraise a site, you say, well, I can achieve that rating by reusing what's on the site. I can't achieve it by building a new steel and cladding glass structure, and quite quickly that then has to be your choice planning. I think the VAT is really powerful. I think that would be another powerful measure that kind of could be added to it.
Yeah.
Can I just add one thing to Mike's comment?
Go on, Nicholas. Yeah.
Perhaps to sort of put it where I mean. Historically, the discussion about, say, VAT on reuse of buildings versus new build has been a thing about heritage, and it's been the heritage lobby pushing it. That's a bit unfair, but that's broadly how it's been perceived. Because now that argument is broadening, as we were just discussing, and because of the legally binding commitment to 2050 targets, I think it is a matter of time. I was perhaps being a little bit depressing earlier, but we haven't got the Treasury yet. But I think we will get there. We just need, all these aims and concerns need to line up, and government needs to, well, bits of government need to catch up with where other bits of government are. So I think we will get there, but it's quite hard to turn a super tank around.
But isn't it also the case that there's perhaps a reticence to alienate very powerful forces in new build construction? Our economy has been built in many ways on disposable use of materials, hasn't it? So this is quite a big, even if it makes complete sense when you're trying to flatten that emissions curve, it's still kind of counter to the way that our economy has been run for a long time, don't you think?
I think it's even more profound than that. I mean, I agree, but I think it's even more profound than that, which is, where's growth in the British economy been over the last generation? It's been in the southeast. Actually, historically, that's not a very strange pattern. Britain's been quite southeast heavy. Apologies, Colin. It sounds like you're not from the southeast. Britain's been quite southeast heavy for most of its history. Actually, there was this a brief period about 250 years with the Industrial Revolution when that very firmly ceased being the case. So it's not that strange a pattern. But we have grown in greenfields, ever since the 1930s, largely in the Midlands and the southeast. we've got to rediscover the place value of towns and cities and villages and centres, where you can lead a prosperous and purposeful life, within that 15-minute or 20 or 5-minute environment. So the idea that you don't just abandon the centre of Sunderland or abandon the centre of Rochdale and go off and build somewhere else, we've got to rethink about how we live. So I think I agree with you, but I think it's even more profound than that.
I think there is an issue actually, at its core is about, as a capitalist society, capitalism depends on constant economic growth, but actually constant economic growth is no longer actually sustainable. It's not something we can continue to sign up to in the same way.
But it's going to be anathema to the current government to say we shouldn't have an economy based on GDP growth, isn't it?
I certainly wouldn't make your argument that way, certainly. But actually, I slightly disagree, because I think it's what we mean by growth and how we measure growth and how we think of growth. So, growth is people, leading happier lives in better health with more of what they need. It doesn't have to mean jumping in a shiny Mercedes to go from place A over there to place B over there. How you measure it is important, and what you mean by it is important. But I think if you turn around and say we're not expecting people to lead better, longer, healthier lives with more of what they feel they need to lead it, I don't think that's a sensible way of making the argument. Sorry, I'm not trying to jump on you, but
there is a tension there, isn't there, between appealing to what you think voters might want, and what you think is going to absolutely drive economic recovery, given the state that the economy is in at the moment, and this desire to tackle the climate emergency. I kind of felt we were seeing that with the two rather similar slogans that emerged in terms of how the government was going to rebuild the economy post-COVID. First of all, you heard build back better, and I think most of the people in this panel debate probably would have said, yeah, that's not a bad slogan, build back better. That's talking about some of these other challenges, perhaps higher quality and taking into account the sustainability arguments. But then we also heard build, 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 and we've heard build, build, build perhaps more in recent weeks than we heard build back better. And build, 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 to me, is all about new build. I may be misinterpreting it, but it doesn't sound to me like it's in any way about retrofitting or about preserving the embodied carbon of buildings.
No, I think that's probably fair, Will. Maybe it should be build, build, build back better, or maybe that's
getting very long. You like these very long things, don't you?
No, I don't. I didn't choose that name. But joking apart, and I was joking, by the way. The collision between the need to improve our footprint on the planet, or rather reduce our footprint on the planet, and the needs, which I think every fair-minded person does recognise, obviously that, but also to rebalance our economy geographically, so we're not as focused essentially on one region and a few hotspots. That does mean rediscovering, yes, the embedded carbon in terms of this discussion, but also actually the power and the place of a whole bunch of towns and cities and villages and
forgotten place.
Exactly. So use whatever rhetoric you like, but actually how we reuse all the embedded carbon in Liverpool is not just a question of the environment. It's also a question of the history and the culture and the place value and the potential for human prosperity of one of the great cities of this country, which is, I think I'm right in saying, I'd probably be corrected, I think it's still at about 45% of the population of it was in the 1930s. Now, some of that was overcrowding, so it's probably good that it's been reduced, but not probably to that degree.
Well, we don't need to look at sort of slamming the volume house builders, for example. If we're saying, okay, we need somebody to build in volume, actually potentially we're just asking them to look at a different way of doing it. So if we look at Heritage Count report that was published in 2019 by Historic England, it looked at the Lancashire and Yorkshire textile mills. There were over 1,300 unused and vacant mills up in that area, which Historic England calculated could generate 283,000 additional jobs and provide 52,000 new homes. But because it's retrofit or reconditioning of old building stock, it doesn't make sense to a volume house builder to pay the 20% VAT that it would take to do that work.
Exactly.
With
Because
the regulation of the VAT, you know,
Yeah.
you get a huge, as Nicholas was saying, you get a much better levelling up. You've got all that amazing industrial heritage building up in the Midlands and the North, which could be repurposed. But at the moment, nobody's incentivized to do so.
No, and nobody talks about the
It's
housing
not a question of
target.
incentivizing. It's just having level playing field. I mean, we're not even asking to incentivize. We're just asking not to disincentivize.
Yeah.
And that's my point about the fundamental contradiction between the NPPF and our VAT policy, and between the government's levelling up policy and their VAT policy. So I think all we're asking, we're not. You could ask for more, but I mean, all I'm asking at this level for is just be consistent. Just start there.
Yeah, and the 300,000 target of new homes every year, is that ever talked about? Has anyone ever heard that talked about in terms of part retrofit? Obviously, you're going to have some new build to achieve those numbers, but
that's a very good question. Well, I can't off the top of my head recall if I've ever seen it broken down in that way by the government. I don't think so, but it may well be that one of our expert listeners can correct me on that. I don't think I've seen that. Certainly people have done the numbers in terms of what's actually delivered. And
yeah,
obviously under PD, there was quite a high proportion of repurposing for several years. That's now dipped down in the last couple of years. But
yeah, because I guess my point there is that it's a little bit like GDP. It's like that is one of the primary drivers for the government. They're always looking at those numbers. They're always looking at how much closer can we get to 300,000? You know, how can we tell people that we've turned this around and we're really tackling the housing crisis? You know, so it strikes me that if they began to think of that in a different way, that you can make new spaces and new homes of existing buildings and contribute to that target, that would go some of the way, as would equalisation of VAT rates, to making this agenda viable.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
It also plays into the cleaning up and regenerating depressed urban areas. You know, it's not just reusing the building stock. You're also regenerating and cleaning at the same time.
But the challenge, and I'm conscious that probably me and Hannah are speaking too much, Colin might not enough, so I'll say this and I promise I should. I think the challenge for the government, for any government, and are very hard to avoid one, and one which we saw in some of the response to the white paper a month ago, is that there is a inescapable tension between two targets. One is building enough homes, and the other is levelling up and rebalancing the economy. I mean, as a statement of fact, the demand for homes is more in the southeast than in other regions. And what the less prosperous regions need is not actually more homes. They need more prosperity and activity and more demand. Actually, there is ample housing stock in much of the country, just not in the places where the most demand is. And that's a vicious problem. And it's one where their aims are actually unavoidably contradictory.
And turning to COP26, I don't know whether the panel will have views on this, but I understand that's the biggest global conference this country has ever held. Obviously, it's been pushed back from the end of this year to, I think, the end of next year because of COVID. And I'm not sure, Mike, if you can say much about this, but do you think, or other panel members think that retrofitting and reuse in construction could form part of the message at that conference?
Absolutely will, and I think it has to. I think the message that's coming out of a lot of the numbers and the government's own targets and the international targets is that we have to take fairly drastic steps if we're going to meet these climate challenges. And I think putting the numbers to it helps. I think when you see the tons of embodied carbon that go into new construction, it's fairly obvious that we need to be reusing more of our building stock. I do really think the important thing is to have an enforceable rating system for the whole life energy cost of buildings. I guess I mentioned this already, but we measure the operational energy. We don't mandate that people achieve targets on the embodied energy in buildings. And there's a huge amount of embodied energy that goes into those. If on every building we measured it and we mandated that people achieve low numbers of embodied carbon, you would therefore see people reusing more existing masonry buildings. You would see people probably building more timber, which is also an effective thing. But one of the biggest things is you would see people reusing building stock to meet those targets if it was mandated.
How would it be mandated? Through building regs or the planning system or both?
Yeah, I mean, Colin sort of mentioned the LETI and the REBA targets. I think for operational energy, we have planning policy demands that you achieve certain efficiency of building energy use. And the different institutions, so we're collaborating with the Institution of Structural Engineers at the moment to create a carbon rating scheme, which is a bit like the sticker system you get on white goods or your washing machine, or an EPC rating, and to say, as Colin was saying, what is good. So what is a good kilograms per square meter for a building for embodied carbon? And I think REBA and LETI are doing that for the whole of a building, not just the structure, because the structure is only half. And if we can get those targets established and every building is required to report on them, then I think you can start penalising the ones that get poor ratings. I don't know what Colin thinks.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Whether it could become part of Part L or whether it would be a separate part of the building regs, there certainly has to be something in there that has to be mandated around embodied carbon. It's interesting that I was reading, well, it was the AG actually, that the government response to the campaign was to say, we're not thinking about any VAT changes at the moment, but they have rolled out.
And the Treasury weren't there yet. Sorry, Colin.
Well, they've rolled out this the Green Home Grant program, which starts next month. The interesting thing about that, I think, is that it's again, there's no mention of embodied carbon in there. So you can be up for a £5,000 check, if you like, to contribute towards making your home more energy efficient, but without having the knowledge to understand whether the embodied carbon and what you do to make it more efficient is going to negate the efficiency in and of itself. You know, it's purely a one line of attack. It's purely looking at energy consumption as opposed to the whole picture of energy and embodied carbon. And I really like that idea that you were talking about there, Mike. I was talking to a colleague about how do you understand the embodied carbon in building materials or assemblies. Well, maybe we need some kind of labeling system, traffic light system, even like you have on food packaging, that allows you to see what's good and what's bad. Because Joe Blow can pop down to B&Q to retrofit his own home and buy some insulation. How does he know his insulation isn't going to be high in embodied carbon? And the savings are going to happen, if at all, way down the line. It's hard enough for architects to get their heads around all of this, let alone the public in general. It's a really challenging position, and potentially £2 billion the government are handing out to do something that could potentially be quite harmful.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, you look at building facades, and we have this debate that you might design a building facade to reduce solar gain, and therefore you reduce your energy used for cooling. But the building facade is made of aluminium, which has got a huge amount of carbon locked into it. And actually you need to appraise whether you've used more carbon fabricating the aluminium facade than you're going to save from the cooling. And it's just switching this in-use energy to the whole life assessment and making data available and making good decisions based on the lowest carbon option every time. And reusing things will always come out better in that sort of approach.
And what you've just said, Colin, strongly suggests that the government doesn't understand the whole life carbon agenda. There might be some individuals in it who do, but as a whole, this was one of the sort of flagship policies, wasn't it, of recent months, and how they're going to respond to the downturn and the climate emergency.
It certainly seems that way. It's been perhaps, I'm talking out of line here, a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction. They've got some money out there for you to use. At first appearance, it would seem like a logical way forward, but without having the knowledge base behind it to understand all the implications, especially when you're talking not necessarily directly about energy, but about climate and carbon. It's the emergency we're talking about. That's what we're in right now.
Yeah.
That's what we need to address. And it has to happen now, not in 5 years' time, 10 years' time. So,
yeah.
So yeah,
just on a hope, perhaps a slightly more hopeful note, and I'm conscious the sun's now hitting my face in a slightly disconcerting way. I'll just try and move out of the rays. I mean, look, I think let's not confuse what's happened over the last few months with where the government can be got to. I mean, there was and is, understandably, I think, a desire to sort of get money out of the door and do stuff fast for bounce back better, bounce, better, build, whatever combination of Bs you want. And I don't think that's unreasonable. It's not surprising. I don't think, I mean, despite the good work that, I mean, Hannah was quoting the brilliant work that Historic England has done, which I would also recommend you all go and read. I don't think I've yet seen pulled together, maybe it's been in the AJ and I haven't seen it, and I apologise well if it is there, but I don't think I've yet seen pulled together, in 10 pages, that comprehensive case, environmentally, economically, spatial equality, and also looking forward as well as looking back. How do we build new buildings so that they're flexible and resilient and capable of recycling in the future? I've not seen that full case brought together in a way that will tick the different boxes of different agendas, and it's not just a purely environmental, just a purely this. So I think there's still important work to be done to make that comprehensive big picture case. And that's not in any way to belittle the work that Michael, Colin or Will that you've done, or Hannah. I just don't think it's quite come together in the right way yet. But I do think the battle is there to be won, because the vast majority of people get this about the environment. Just some people are worrying about other things, in their day job.
Yeah, but there is just always that danger of greenwash, isn't there? I'm not disagreeing with you, Nicholas, but there's always a danger of greenwash, whether it comes from government or from industry. You sort of think,
and a lot of buildings are greenwash. They say they're green because they got some pot plants on the balcony, and they say that I can see from my window out here, I can see Strada Tower with those the unmoving windmills up at the top. So absolutely there is in both private and public sector. I couldn't agree more.
It's a bit like the sort of headlong rush to electric vehicles. We can carry on building roads and road tunnels under the Thames, and because we're all going to be driving electric cars. Well, hold on a minute. Every electric car, 50% of its lifetime emissions go into actually building it. So before you've even driven it, you've used up half of the emissions over its entire lifetime. It's a bit like a new house. I'm not sure that is understood, because people think, electric cars are green. It's as simple as that.
I think that's probably fair.
And the issue's actually increasing in importance, isn't it? Because as a society, we've been so focused on reducing our in-use energy consumption in our homes, in our cars, in our buildings. That's actually now dropping. We've been quite good at it, and it's dropping as an overall proportion of the whole. So I think 30 years ago, operational energy made up most of the energy whole life of a building. Now more than half is kind of in the embodied. There's actually progress.
I was going to say that's a positive story. That's a positive story of success. Now let's go to the next let's go to the next battle. We've got over that, got over Beach and Brook. Now let's get to the next, the next ride.
I think there is also a really important piece around educating everybody when we're talking about individual homes and homeowners, because of course most of the building stock is privately owned. We're not talking about main organisations. We're talking about individuals and individual decisions, and our collective knowledge on just something as fundamental as repair and maintenance. How many householders now genuinely understand what they need to do to repair and maintain their homes properly in a way that maximizes the energy efficiency? It's far easier to take a stick-on solution, and actually the reality of what properly drives efficiency is a lot more boring than that. It's guttering, it's maintenance, it's insulation. It's
my favourite part of each year, fixing the gutters. Yes, absolutely.
It's not exciting. It's not sexy.
No, it's not. Absolutely not.
Actually, it's what needs to be done. And obviously, with the introduction of PAS 2035, which BEIS have supported and are pushing through, so that actually the people who are going to be retrofitting homes and assessing retrofit actually know what they're doing and are looking at a collective holistic approach to the house, not just individual patching up pieces, I think is really important.
And as you know, Hannah, there are horror stories of people who don't understand how a historic building works, assuming you can manage it like a house that was built in 1970 and causing far more harm than good in doing so.
Absolutely. So there is a huge education, public education and specific skills education piece that goes along with all of this to actually drive it sustainably going forward.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Hannah. And I sort of take your point that some of it is kind of dull, this subject. But I was quite heartened actually that when the Retrofirst campaign got picked up by the BBC over the summer.
Congratulations, Will. Congratulations.
It was
well
silly
done.
season. It was silly season, so a lot of people were probably on their holidays and not reading about this.
No, well, it's because of brilliant editorial direction from Mr. Hurst.
Thank you. That's too kind. But what really heartened me was not that it got on the BBC, but that they then told me it had been really, really popular. You know, like I think 640,000 people viewed the story in just a few hours, and the BBC editors were really, really pleased with that, because they hadn't necessarily expected that, you know, save old buildings would be of interest. But it does suggest to me that we need, as a sector, to work harder to engage the public. And if we try, they will support this agenda and they will, you know, get interested in it. Maybe that's optimistic, but yeah.
No, I don't think it is.
No,
I think it's very reasonable, because it's not just save old buildings because they're lovely old buildings, which I wholly agree with. It's a far wider agenda than that. And
coming back to you, Hannah, how is the heritage sector as a whole, in your view, responding to this agenda? Because I suppose it's sort of, on the whole, it's a positive thing for heritage, isn't it? Saying, you know, as well as architectural and historic value, if a building happens to have that, it also has this value in terms of embodied carbon, which we haven't necessarily talked about that much, or hasn't been recognised by wider society as being very important until now. But on the other hand, as well as that new sort of weapon to defend existing buildings that the heritage lobby can wield, there's also kind of tricky things there about, you know, do you then start to accept, if carbon becomes the most important thing, do you then have to accept, oh, you know, we've got to have triple glazing in this this very old listed building that you know the heritage sector would normally balk at?
Well, if we were taking Mike's metrics of embodied carbon and your total carbon, you know, impact, potentially you could offset the fact that your building was built in 1100 with your glazing situation. And actually, you know, in its totality, it works. You know, you could argue the most sustainable building in the City of London is the White Tower. It's not Bloomberg.
What's your view on this, Colin?
Yeah, well, let's not talk about Bloomberg, shall we?
Yeah, that caused a bit of a stink, didn't it, when it won the Sterling?
Indeed, it was interesting. I think the exercise to get the best score ever on BREEAM kind of overtook the whole reality of what's sustainable, what isn't in that particular case. But there you go.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, historic buildings. It's funny. When you walk around London, and sorry, I'm very sort of London centric, despite my accent there, Nicholas. I look at some of the old buildings, and quite often they're shrouded by some more modern buildings all around them. And I think about some research I did a while back when I was doing my PhD, and it's about shared distributed energy. And I'm thinking these old houses are struggling because they're cold and they're not thermally efficient. Next door to a hotel or a big commercial building, what's generating a lot of excess energy. How do we dump the heat out of this building because it's so damn hot? And I'm thinking, can you not just pipe it next door to that building? It's a beautiful building. It's part of our heritage. We have to look after. And you know, I'm sure there's some great opportunities for us to take what's troubling for some of our modern buildings to deal with in terms of the way they perform thermally and heating and cooling in summer, and give it over to our buildings that aren't necessarily as good. And you don't want to fiddle with the fabric where you don't have to. I think there might be something in that. I'm just talking off the top of my head here, but that might be something worth thinking a little bit more about. We do have distributed energy systems in London, but they're not not massive. I think 10, 15 years ago there was a big drive, in fact probably longer than that, when Ken Livingstone was mayor. It was a huge concept that was being driven very hard indeed, but not so much these days. And I think also
you're talking about CHP plants.
Yeah, and you know, the day is done really in terms of and certainly in buildings, because the grid is so much cleaner now than it was back then. So there was potentially a time where gas could have been seen as a transition fuel to help us get to our carbon targets, but that's been and gone. We've got to go all electric really now to do that. So if you want to do distributed, it has to be a system that's going to be avoiding fossil fuels, ground source heat pumps, large technology like that. So it's going to be the way forward.
Yeah,
if I may, sorry, but Mike, you go.
No, I was just going to support what Colin was saying, and the all electric buildings really in terms of their operational use. I mean, we've designed a few now and recently opened one at 80 Charlotte Street as all electric, and at 1 Triton Square as well. And really, you know, as the grid gets greener and greener, that is the answer really, and it's entirely doable now. I think the industry's been pushing that technology for 10 years or so, and we're kind of now seeing that first buildings realise that they have all electric energy supply and use. And as the grid gets greener, then I think we're making really good progress to kind of ticking that box off.
Yeah. And there's no reason why you can't combine that with retrofitting of existing buildings, is there?
Absolutely not.
No.
I mean, that one I just mentioned, 1 Triton Square, was an existing 1990s building off Euston Road, and we have redeveloped it. I mean, going back to Nicholas's point about GDP, this was a big construction project. We've doubled the net internal area of a large commercial HQ building, a huge construction project employing thousands of people. I don't get the argument that there's a kind of reduced GDP for there. It's offered back to the market. It's achieved increased rents. It's a big commercial success for a big commercial developer. But we've reused all of the existing structure, say 40,000 tons of carbon in doing so, and also put all electric plant in the building and lowered its operational energy use. So, it's all design, isn't it? You can combine all of these things and make a success as long as we know what our targets are.
Yeah. I don't know what proportion of the GDP of this country has been driven, linked to the City of London over the last 20 years, but it's a lot more than a square mile's worth. That's working obviously on a medieval street pattern, with Cheapside being a Roman street. So there's no reason why our historic town and city centres can't be very associated with the GDP growth. I mean, just very great. And in fact, we know they're super associated with GDP growth because they are more productive places.
So I've just got some questions coming in now from the audience. This one's from Mike Coleman. He says, possibly one of the most visible examples of retrofit is the Grenfell Tower. So what good stories can be raised as news stories that just maybe the media might also wish to champion? I guess that's a tricky one, because
the question.
Yeah, I guess he's saying that the media in that instance, which for very understandable reasons, because it was an appalling tragedy, is focusing on a retrofit that's gone badly wrong and has been botched and people have lost their lives as a result. I guess he's saying, is there a way of trying to rehabilitate retrofit in the media and the public eye?
Well, sorry, Hannah.
I was just going to say, I think the story Mike just gave us about the project in Charlotte Street is a fantastic example.
Yeah.
It's got economic drivers, it's environmentally sound, it's generated a lot of growth and profit.
Yeah. I think
given another example would be the Welsh streets in Liverpool and some of the community-led recycling of historic houses, some of the work the various CLTs are doing. Embarrassingly, I've forgotten its name. There's a beautiful refacing of a concrete frame in Wimbledon, in Morden, that we used on the front cover of B4C because we thought it made our points at several levels. I've embarrassingly forgotten its name, and I know the architect, and he's going to be cross with me, but there we go. I'll tweet it around later.
I think in terms of a heritage building that we've done, Hannah, you probably know, but a Great Arthur House, built in the 1950s. I don't think they did any. It's a City of London building, which we planned its entirety, and It's been a very successful project for the City of London, and a project that was initially, I think my understanding is the windows and the facade itself was built using the same technology as the Routemaster buses. So we had to try and design something that was going to match that, but obviously with a much better performance behind it. So yeah, I mean, there are plenty of good stories around.
I guess
Ellington House by Matt Architecture. That was what I was trying to do. I looked it up.
Yes, yeah. Well, I think we've just done that as a case study.
There you go.
It's a good one.
I was
Mike, you were going to...
Yeah, I was walking through King's Cross recently, and I spent some time working on the redevelopment of the station there. And there's a new roof on the Western Concourse, but the big thing that's been done is the kind of regeneration of the Grade 1 listed Victorian train station. And I think, like, from some of the heritage that our country has, I think some of the revitalization of some of those into new modern facilities are probably, like, in terms of sort of appeal to the wider public, there's some really, really major iconic projects. I mean, St Pancras Station, obviously the Eurostar terminal is a retrofit project, and that's one of the most incredible spaces sort of I've ever stood in. And you walk further through, this is all in King's Cross, but the coal drops yards that we've been involved in refurbishing, and there's some new construction alongside the old coal drops, and those have all been converted into sort of high-end retail. People have different opinions on it, but it's an incredible space, and they're all existing buildings, and I think people really enjoy that.
I mean, if Will forgive me banging a Craig Street's drum for 5 seconds, I think I'm right in saying that just under 40% of our housing stock was built pre-World War II. You know, there was a period of about 20, 30 years after the war where they were all condemned as, past it. Actually, they're sailing on into the 21st century as some of the most popular and valuable and sought after houses. So, many of the houses that many of us live in are, over 100 years old, and they're still going strong. And the stats, Hannah, I think, came close to citing them earlier. The embodied energy in a Victorian semi-detached house would take a car about 10 times around the world. So many of us are living in good examples of this.
But I guess something within Mike's question is the safety aspect. The fact that, you've got to reassure the public that retrofitting isn't going to lead, or indeed the drive for greener buildings isn't going to lead to massive safety problems. Grenfell's one example of where they were trying to improve the energy efficiency of the tower. And indeed, the whole argument about using timber more, I noticed this from looking at what the Citizens Climate Assembly said a few days ago in its final report. Although the Assembly backed the use of timber, much greater use of timber in construction by, I think, 82%, there were a lot of concerns about, well, what does this mean for fire? So there is a kind of job there, isn't there, for the industry to persuade the public that this can be done, properly and safely, even if that involves, changing our procurement methods, changing the building regs. They have to have that confidence, don't they, that this drive for zero carbon buildings isn't going to imperil people who live in and use these buildings.
It's the quality assurance issue as well, isn't it? It's driving quality and standards throughout construction, and trying to reassure not just the layperson, but actually a lot of people in the industry that you're going to have something done to sufficient quality.
Yeah. And I think you're right. Shouting about some of these example projects is a good way. We have to shout as loudly about the good ones as
Yeah.
It's hard to make the good ones as big a news story as the disasters, isn't it? But it's shouting about the good ones. I mean, we've done an all timber building for Sky in the last few years. We've refurbished, buildings to really high quality for big commercial developers that are being let by big name tenants and they're high end office buildings. And so I think shouting about those more would be.
But we're not calling out, the other side, are we? We're not calling out as a matter of course buildings that are completely unsustainable new builds that involve, thousands of tons of CO2 that could have been saved. I mean, I see new glass skyscrapers going up all over London at this very minute, and nobody in the industry seems to say this is a problem.
I go out and say it's a problem, but arguably I'm not in the industry. I don't know whether I count enough. But there are people saying it's problematic. Well,
there are people who are saying it's problematic, but not as a single voice. It's there's this politeness, which I understand. Journalists are the same. They tend to be on the whole, polite to other journalists, and architects are polite to other architects. But if we're in an emergency, perhaps we need to understand the media does pick up on negative stories more than positive. They are going to be more interested in stories where things have gone wrong than, look at this wonderful retrofit project that's everything's gone right on. But so with that in mind, surely we need to be more vocal about these sort of egregious new builds that are not going to last 10 years.
Well, I think one of the most depressing conversations I had was with a senior project manager, construction project manager. I was walking around London with him, and he pointed out a building that was just completing on the banks of the Thames. And he said, in my career, I've seen that building built 3 times. It's come down, it's gone up, it's come down, it's gone up, it's come down, and what was being built there was only going to last. He may well see building number 4.
Yeah.
And indeed, that's built in, as I'm sure you all know, that's built into the cost modelling and the value modelling of these of many of these buildings. When you get
it's also built into the planning, isn't it?
Yeah.
Things are granted planning consent on the understanding that they're going to be knocked down in 35 years. They're not expected to be a permanent part of our skyline.
It's not just how operational buildings are; it's where they are. So I mean, the lunacy of a green building, which may or may not be efficient, but which you have to drive to. It's where they are, it's what they are, it's actually how long they're going to last, which, and again, forgive me, Will, isn't just a function of how effectively they're built, it's also a function of whether people like them or not. Ugly buildings, when they lose their function, get pulled down. Buildings that people love get recycled. There are lots of examples of listed buildings, built as all sorts of things, which are now on their 15th use because people just wish them to stay there. The old phone booths are the classic example, where they're now being phone booths all got put into sort of sheds when they got knocked down in the 1980s, and now coming back into use as defibrillators or coffee bars because people love them because they are things of beauty. And that's perhaps not a major green case, but it is a profounder case more broadly. We have to build buildings loose fit and, yes, I will say it, and beautiful things that will last because people want them to, emotionally as well as empirically.
But the public's taste is always changing, isn't it, Nicholas?
I mean, the public's taste is reliably predictable, Will.
But
they love everything in the AJ and nothing else.
But didn't you just say yourself that there was a long period in which everyone hated?
No, I didn't say everyone. I didn't say everyone.
Or the public mood on the whole was not very keen on Victorian and Edwardian buildings, was it?
I didn't say public mood.
Well, okay. Forgive me. You tell me what you did say.
No, there was actually, understandably. So look, I mean, just going down a level from being silly. After World War II, 2 wars, rent controls, 100 years of coal pollution. Britain's towns and cities, starting with an incipient deindustrialization, were in a pretty shoddy state. I think that's just a fact. Planning policy was very actively promoting the population of towns and cities and actively promoting building outside them. So the moods intellectually had swung against our historic towns and cities, to some degree matched in public demand, though much less than, I would argue officially, and I think there's good history on that. And indeed, the public never quite went along with what the planners intended for them. So yes, they partly fell out of love, but they very quickly came back into love as soon as some of those fundamental problems of enhanced urban mortality and pollution started to be fixed, which they were being fixed from the 1910s and 20s onwards. The urban mortality premium was gone by 1922, and obviously from 1950s you had much cleaner air in towns and cities. So as soon as those things were fixed, town centres where there were jobs came thriving back, and the terrace streets with them. He says, tongue not entirely in cheek.
So we've got we're getting some very long questions, so if people can submit slightly shorter questions, that would really help me, because I don't know how much of these to read out. But we've got one from Warren Williams, who's just come in, who says, I think the points made relating to the unglamorous aspects of understanding how existing buildings behave, particularly with regard to breathability and how one should retrofit them and minimize technical risks, is pertinent. As this is not widely taught, and small or medium builders have generally lost the skills of working with breathable materials such as lime, how could one best educate the professionals and the non-professionals, and indeed the government? That's a tricky one.
I'm going to leave that to my learned members on the panel, I think.
I think there are several issues, obviously, or within that. There's this split up until about 1990, I'd say. Construction was construction, and the people working in construction predominantly had experience of working on traditional building stock. But as the construction industry has accelerated and diverged, and you now have off-site manufacturing, you have more sort of, dare I say it, automotive industry behaviours coming into the construction industry. You have a greater degree of digitization, which is a good thing in many ways. You get a divergence in the skill set. So you can have construction professionals who are spectacular at working on digitally modelled glass and concrete buildings, who wouldn't have the first clue whether to use NL3 or NL5.
Sorry, my ignorance, what's NL3 and NL5?
The type of lime mortar mix that you would use to repair.
Sounds like a droid on Star Wars, or two droids on Star Wars.
It's cooler, actually. I've noticed a great correlation between heritage construction people and Star Wars nerds. There seems to go together quite nicely.
I think from our perspective, I think that's a really good point, Hannah, because it wasn't that long ago when I was starting out in architecture, and everything was done in a very traditional, conventional way, and so architects could be really at the core of the whole project, whereas nowadays you've got, I mean, there'll be a lot of instances where we would have to have a cladding specialist who would come on board to help us with particular issues around the cladding systems. Historic buildings, you tend to have architects, they're going to specialise in that kind of construction and using lime mortars where you've got that ability for the bricks to move and get rid of the movement joints and all that kind of stuff. Everyone's getting into their niches a little bit, I think, in the construction industry. So whether or not you need to educate across the board, or whether there's enough specialists around in each kind of area to meet the needs, I'm not sure if that answers the question.
Actually, it's funny, Colin, you've just picked up on another question that's come in. Cyprian Edmonds asked this, who thanks you for raising the point about the rush to the Green Home Grant, and says, is it also the case, as well as that there aren't enough qualified retrofit coordinators, and indeed who will assess the work that's being carried out?
In 6 months, I mean, because you've got to have it completed, I understand, by the 31st of March.
Yeah, it's a very quick turnaround, isn't it?
It's a full order, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's a very good question.
If you're doing a ground floor extension, you'd have to have gone for planning permission or permitted development pretty much as soon as the government announced it, before they've even announced the full details, in order to actually have completed the thing and benefit from the grant.
Indeed.
It looks like they're overreaching. I mean, what the government's trying desperately to do clearly is to incentivise economic activity for reasons we've already discussed. But I agree, that looks like they've incentivised a bit too far.
Yeah. Okay. Any other points that the panel want to make? We're approaching the end of this really interesting discussion.
If I may, just 5 seconds, I'd repeat the point I made earlier, which is I think there's still a need to pull together the profound economic, regional equity, environmental, place value case for changing the way, not just that we manage old buildings, but actually that we create new ones, either the looseness of fit, the ability to evolve over time. So, I mean, I think there's still more work to do to make the case to government in a way that will profoundly, convince everyone in government, and which will carry a sufficient number of people in the country with them. Because I think
who should make that case?
You should. Well, actually, all of us on this call and hundreds of others. I mean, I think there's multiple bodies that could do it. And success always has many parents. So I think.
But isn't that the sort of thing that clever civil servants do? That they look at several challenges that governments have, and they manage to come up with solutions.
And they come out to industry to ask for our opinions and our
I find
advice.
it a bit strange that you're saying this is all on industry to fix, and government's just this sort of passive body that's going to listen, but you know, it has to be made absolutely dummy proof for them to do anything.
I'm not really making a comment on what government should or shouldn't do. I'm just saying that those of us outside government who wish to influence it, on the whole, it's best to try and influence it rather than waiting for a civil servant to work it out on your behalf. I mean, yes, I agree, and hopefully they will, but nevertheless, you know, one should be master of one's own fate, I think.
Okay.
I think it's very refreshing to the extent to which, in my experience, civil servants are willing and ready to reach out and want to have discussions and to get best practice and advice from industry. I think it would be very dangerous if people were trying to make policy in isolation without reference to what industry either can deliver or wants to deliver, or believes is best. So I welcome the dialogue that I know is already going on, and the opportunity to shape it.
But that's heartening. It sounds like both Nicholas, you and Hannah, you're saying the door is open, or the door's ajar.
I do feel it's open on this. It's not all the way open, but it is open. And I think I'd rather it was open than it was shut. Yeah.
Well, that's a very positive note to end on. It sounds like all to play for.
Yes, I think so.
Yes. And well, thank you very much to our panel. It's been a really great conversation. So it's very kind of you to join us this afternoon. Hopefully we can have more of these discussions in the future. Given we're not having our live events too much at the moment, we're having these virtual events, but they seem to work pretty well. Thank you also to our audience. I'm sorry I didn't get to ask all your questions. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Will.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Cheers.
Cheers.